Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Climate Crisis, Finding Hope Through a Trinitarian View of Creation. This is the first out of two sessions. So thank you for joining us for this first instance of our series. Before we begin, I will give you a few instructions so that those who prefer French can listen to the session in that language. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre réunion webinaire, cliquez sur Interprétation, le bouton Interprétation, et après, cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans les contrôles de votre réunion, appuyez sur le bouton avec les trois petits points au plus, et après, appuyez sur Interprétation de la langue. Finalement, appuyez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. C'est important de se souvenir, comme on dit toujours, que l'interprétation linguistique n'est pas disponible lorsque vous accédez à Zoom sur un navigateur web. And now let's do a land acknowledgement before we start with the content. So let us begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands, which many of us call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures. In Canada, from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit, each in our own way, to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And finally, before we move forward with the content, there are a couple of other housekeeping items to address. So the session will be 90 minutes, and this will include the presentation and time for asking questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. You can find a button at the bottom of the screen, so with the letters Q&A. And if you don't enter them in that box, they might be missed in the chat box or in other, if you send them in other ways. So please enter them in the Q&A, through the Q&A button and box. And finally, the recordings of each session will be sent to registered participants within 3 business days. So 3 business days after today. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Father John McCarthy. He is a Jesuit, and he works on the biodiversity of Newfoundland and Labrador lichens and the Department of Biology Herbarium at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. He holds advanced degrees in theology, a PhD in Boreal Forest Ecology, and a master's in soil science. And he was a recipient of the 2002 Canadian Environment Award Gold Medal within the Lands and Forest category for his work in boreal forest conservation in Newfoundland. He's a lichen specialist who has named several species of lichen. Is it lichen or lichen?
Yeah, lichen.
Lichen, perfect.
Lichen in England, but lichen. Yeah.
Perfect. And he has one under his name in his honor, Acaraspora McCarthy. Is that the right pronunciation too?
Yeah, McCarthy I. Acaraspora McCarthy I. I have a picture of it later, so I can show.
Okay, sounds good. We'll clarify then. I hope I pronounced that well. Father John has a vision for a deeper understanding of an integral ecological approach to Canada's boreal forest region. Thank you for being with us today, Father John.
Well, thank you, Jose. Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks, Jose, for the very generous introduction, and also to Clara Atala, who works with you at the Jesuit Communications Office. You've gotten me set up well for this evening, so I'm very, very thankful for that. And I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. Thank you for taking the time and for having the interest to spend the next hour and a half to kind of discuss together, to kind of reflect together on the meaning of a contemplative ecology in the light of the kind of the Catholic Christian notion of Trinity. So I'm going to ask Jose if he would, I'm going to show a short video of 2 minutes is from the Newfoundland and Labrador government. And just to be attentive to the last few seconds of the video, where there's one phrase that's uttered, and we'll focus on that phrase in the presentation. So, Jose.
Throughout this land, for thousands of years, it's been said that everything has a spirit. Not surprisingly, it's where you might find your own. Newfoundland and Labrador.
Throughout this land for thousands of years, it has been said that everything has a spirit. It's not surprising. You might find your own. So I'll just begin with my I think everybody should see that okay. Let me know if not. Climate crisis, finding hope through a Trinitarian view of creation. So basically, this will be the first part.
Just a moment. Sorry, Father John. It's showing on presenter view, so
Yep.
maybe we can start it again.
And go just in the full view. Okay, I'll stop share. Okay. How's that, Jose?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So everybody sees that fine. Great. Finding hope through a Trinitarian view of creation. Just stick here. Obvious. Throughout this land, for thousands of years, it has been said that everything has a spirit, and it's not surprisingly, it's where you might find your own. And so this was a video produced by the Newfoundland and Labrador Tourism Division. You may have seen it on your last flight with Air Canada, the last time you flew, or maybe on the internet. But it's a 2-minute video introducing people to the Torngat Mountains National Park of Northern Labrador. And it's quite interesting that the government writers, the people who put this ad series together, it was a multi-million-dollar project, a very successful project, by the way. It's interesting that they used theological or spiritual language when they offered tourism video. So it has been said that everything has a spirit, and it's where you might find your own. In other words, come to Newfoundland, and you'll certainly find your spirit. I'm from Newfoundland originally. You may have noticed by my accent, but so the Newfoundland government has used these ads, and it taps into the human spirit, if you will, to attract people to come to Newfoundland. and it's been a very, very successful ad. So tonight I'd like to talk about what I call a contemplative ecology as a way forward in the face of our ecological challenges. And in the context of I'll speak from the Christian Catholic tradition. That's the one I know best and obviously deeply rooted in and steeped in. And in the second week, I'd like to use the mystery of the Trinity, the Trinitarian mysticism, to help us to understand this contemplative ecology and how this can become a foundation so that we become agents of hope-filled change in the light of the ecological crisis. So tonight I'm going to focus on the first part, on what I call contemplative parables, and next week focus on the Creator Trinity as a foundation for a contemplative ecology. So what do I mean by a contemplative ecology? I was helped quite a bit by it's a professor at Loyola Marymount, Dr. Douglas Christie. He's written a book called The Blue Sapphire of the Mind, Notes for a Contemplative Ecology. And this is how he defines it. It's an expression of the diverse and wide-ranging desire emerging within contemporary culture to identify our deepest feeling for the natural world as part of our spiritual longing. Because I think what's been happening is that the spiritual language or the language of the sacred is not permitted in a public discourse. The language that dominates is the language of science, economics, technology, finance, politics, etc. But he contends, and I do as well, that spirituality is essential in helping us to meaningfully relate to the natural world and to live a hope-filled response to the erosion of the natural world that we currently experience. So that's the kind of my premise. So Laudato Si, which many of you may know, Pope Francis's encyclical on the ecology, published in 2015, the assumption is throughout the entire encyclical that we need economics, sure, we need good politics, we need good science, good technology, the best our minds can provide. But these are essential, but they're never fully sufficient. And what is also needed is a response that includes the sacred, the religious, the spiritual, the emotional, the contemplative significance of nature. So in other words, to have a deeper view of the created world. And that's what I'd like to focus on tonight. And really asking the question for ourselves, how can we be attentive not to external data, in other words, the data of science, the data of finance, the political systems, the political agreements, but to be attentive to the data of our hearts, to the data of our souls. And this is the interior data that religious language privileges. Religious language will talk of this kind of data. And those of you familiar with the Ignatian tradition, Saint Ignatius, founder of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, he always said, be attentive to what goes on in the depth of your heart. And there you will come to know what it means to make good decisions and to come to understand what is God's will, if you will, in your life. So it's really a desire to be attentive to our full experience of the created world. So this is my outline for the next 2 weeks. I'm going to provide a bit of a context, scientific, cultural context. And tonight, I'll focus on what I call parables of contemplation. I've chosen 7, and they're based on my own experience and how I relate to the natural world. And next week, I'll focus more on the Trinitarian mysticism, the heart of our tradition, the Christian tradition, and see how that can be a real basis for hope in a world of great change and great challenge. And then a concluding word. And you notice that I've used, to the left of your screen here, I've used this amazing painting from David Blackwood. It's called Fire Down on the Labrador. David Blackwood, recently deceased, was a well-known Newfoundland artist. And this is one of his great iconic images. The fishermen are in the lifeboat. You can see the upper right of the image. It's the cold northern Labrador Sea, the Arctic waters. The boat is on fire. The survivors are in the raft, and they don't know what the next day will bring, what the next minute or hour will bring. And at the same time, unbeknownst to them is a whole other world that runs deep within the North Atlantic. The iceberg, as you know, given the relative density of ice is about 0.92 grams per cubic centimeter, the density, and salt water runs at about 1.02 grams per cubic centimeter. So about 90% of the iceberg, as you know, is underwater. And these are magnificent icebergs off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador in the month of May and June. And in the depth of the cold Arctic waters is the humpback whale, which migrates from the warm Caribbean Ocean Sea up to the northern cold North Atlantic, full of food, and where they have their young before returning back to the warm Caribbean seas at a later time. So unbeknownst to the survivors in the boat, in the life raft, is a whole other world, a world of life, a world of meaning. And so basically it's this world that I'd like to introduce tonight. We live on, I think we often live in terms of a veneer. We only see a certain percent of what really goes on in the world. And so I think religious language helps us to plumb the depths of our experience. So it helps us to have eyes to see and ears to hear the 90% that we often don't see. So that's really my intent tonight. So let's look at just a few images of context. I'm going to speak from a religious context, and a religion in this true sense, or the fullest sense of the term. Religion from the Latin religare, ligament that binds the bones together. So a rebinding, a rejoining of that which has been torn asunder. Faith, we often talk about the conflict between faith and science, or between faith and reason, heaven and earth, man and woman, night and day, heaven and body and soul. So we have these dualisms that dominate our thought and dominate our action. But I think authentic religious language, authentic religious action strives to bring these together. It's not either or, but it's always both and. So how to live a life in which it's always both and rather than either or. And Pope Francis, a quote from Pope Francis, Laudato Si, chapter or paragraph 11, he says, if we approach nature without a real sense of awe and wonder and fraternity and beauty, then we will become simply masters. We won't be able to set limits on our immediate needs. By contrast, he says, if there's an intimacy, if we feel an intimacy that unites us with the natural world, then sobriety and care will rise spontaneously. So he's basically saying the same thing. We need a language that helps us to go deep in our relationship with the created world. And this is what I'll present next week. And my hypothesis, my thesis is that the Trinitarian mystical language is a language that can help us, can be an immeasurable help, actually. I won't touch on it a whole lot tonight, but just introduce it. It's interesting that the Christian God is revealed as Trinity, and not only as Trinity, but as Creator Trinity. Now, I imagine that God could have revealed God's self in any way that God wished, if you will. Why did God reveal God's self as Creator Trinity? We believe in God, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. We believe in Jesus Christ. Through him, all things were made. And we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. So notice how the Trinity is revealed, and it's in our credo. It's in the creed. This is the Nicene Creed that we'll often profess on Sunday. The Trinity is revealed as Creator. So what is it about that? And I think that's very significant, actually. So the Trinity calls us to a depth of relationship that is not able to be provided by our scientific, technical, economic, political, financial language. That discourse is essential, as I've said, but it needs to be complemented with, and indeed it needs to be rooted in, I think, a spiritual language that calls us to a depth. Another great part of our context is we live in a world, we live in a universe that has a history, a 14 billion year history from the Big Bang on, which all the galaxies and all the stars and you and me and everything else has come out of this Big Bang billions and billions of years ago. So the universe has a story and still is evolving, still is expanding. So it's not closed, it's not finished. And our Earth, our Earth has a history as well, a 5 billion year old history of great tectonic forces and volcanoes and earthquakes that move the Earth in a constant force of energy and interplay. And in 1968, some of you, and in your age, remember this image from Apollo 8, Earthrise. We often think of the sunrise, but this was the first time that we saw the Earth from a distance. Before that, before 1968, we never had those images really. And so that was a real shift in how we understood ourselves and how we understood our relationship to the world. And as you know, all of creation, all of life has a history through the whole wondrous long-term process of evolution, including our own human family. As you see here, the primate family tree, we apparently come from common ancestor about 6 to 7 million years ago. We didn't evolve from the chimpanzee per se, but the chimpanzee, the great gorillas, the lemurs, all the primates of the world, including ourselves, have a common ancestor. And so, in other words, we have a history as well. And so all of this is something new. It's new, and it's given us a new way of looking at the world, a new way of thinking about our relationship to all of creation, of which we are a part. We too, like everything else, are creatures. A little bit about the historical context. We've only been looking at the relationship between humanity and the environment really only for the last 50 to 60 years. The United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. That was the first time humanity came together at a global level to discuss the issue, how do we relate to the natural world? And then, as you know, 20 years later, the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. I was lucky to be able to be there as a member of a Jesuit team in 1992. And out of this conference came two conventions, many of you may be familiar with. Convention on the Climate Change, the committee or the Conference of Parties, COP27 was recently held in Egypt in 2022, and the Convention on Biodiversity, COP15 was just held in Montreal in 2022. So these are the two conventions that were developed at the Rio conference. They tried to develop a convention on forests, but they were unsuccessful. There was just too much conflict among nations to develop, so they produced what was called a Declaration of Forest Principles. And so over the succeeding years, since 1992, we've had several global fora in Johannesburg in 2002, New York, 2015, back in Rio in 2012 as well, 2012, sorry, and then New York 2015. And then Laudato Si was produced by Pope Francis in 2015. So Laudato Si comes out of a history, it comes out of a context since the Stockholm Conference in 1972. So that's the context. Our science has revealed to us a whole nother world that we never knew existed. The evolving universe, life evolves, the earth evolves. Everything has a story, everything has a history. And then in 2015, Laudato Si, praise be to you, the church begins in a very formal way to reflect as well on our relationship to the rest of creation. So in the time remaining now, just in the next, I'd like to take the next half hour or so, and to look at what I call our parables of contemplation. Parables, really they're stories. The stories that come out of my own experience, out of my studies, out of my research, out of my work with lichens, out of my vocation as a Jesuit. And I've identified 7: poverty of discourse, nature as word, morning nature, all creatures great and small, forest as myth and memory, space and place, and the naming of the creatures. I'd just like to share with you a few images, a few thoughts on each of these parables, and basically asking the question, what are your parables of contemplation? I'm sure you all have them, and how do they help you in your relationship to the natural world? The first one is the poverty of discourse, and we've kind of touched on it at the beginning. Basically, we've kind of capitalized nature. We put a barcode on nature, and we think that nature is of only value in terms of its resources. Obviously, it's essential. We could not do what we're doing tonight. We could not live without the food, the fiber, the wood, the water, the minerals of the world. So it's how we relate to that and how we deal with it. That's the question. And so, but in general, the dominant, I would call it an ideology, or the dominant paradigm in the world today is a financial paradigm. And we would say that if it's not of economic value, then it has no value. But really, this is really misplacing the value. You know, we often think there are some things money can't buy, but everything else is MasterCard. You know, so the question of finance is key, obviously. We need to have good financial stewardship, good economic policy, but they don't define the value. They come after we define other values that are important to us. Let's take an example. As you know, as Jose mentioned at the beginning, I live in Sudbury in mid-northern Ontario, and Sudbury is the mining capital of Canada. We've been mining here since the late 19th century, mostly nickel, copper, and it's been a landscape that has been devastated, polluted, industrialized to a great extent. But for the past 50 years, a great story of restoration, of ecological restoration. So it's been through its own kind of crucifixion, and now there's something of a resurrection at work. But the main company in Sudbury is a Brazilian company called Vale. And Vale has a major mine in northern Labrador. This is their nickel operation in Voisey's Bay in Labrador. So as you know, whenever you process ore, mineral ore, there's a lot of waste. So from this mine in northern Labrador, they sent the ore to, some of it was processed in Sudbury, but now it's all being processed in Newfoundland. So they determined that they would produce about 400,000 tons of waste a year, a slurry. And then the big question is, what do you do with 400,000 tons of waste from copper ore or from nickel ore? It can be quite toxic in many ways. So what they did, they decided to build a big, take a major lake system, drain it, take out the fish, line it, and that became the receptacle. They changed the Fisheries Act, the Canadian Fisheries Act, so they could use natural bodies of water as basically receptacles, you know, as waste systems for the waste from the mine. As you can imagine, there was a lot of debate in Newfoundland at the time. You know, how can you take a pristine lake and just drain it and turn it into a waste pool? But that's what they did. And in the debates, this is a quote from the environment minister of the day. She said, "Don't let emotion get in the way. Science has shown that there is nothing about which to be concerned." Now, in many ways, with all due respect to the minister, she didn't get the point at all. In other words, she says, don't let emotion get in the way. In other words, don't let language of the soul, language of the heart get in the way, because science has shown that there's nothing to be concerned about. But again, that's not the point, because to deal with 400,000 tons of waste a year, it is something to be concerned about. And so basically, you get a misplacing of values. And Mark Carney, a Canadian economist, a former Director General of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. This is a quote from one of his recent books on values. "Why is water," he says, "which is essential to life, virtually free, whereas diamonds, which have limited utility beyond their beauty, are so expensive?" And so basically it's a question of values are being missed. Why do we put more value on diamonds than on water, which is essential to life? Whereas diamonds, we would say, are not essential to human life. He poses another question. Why is Amazon, the company Amazon, rated as one of the world's most valuable companies by financial markets, but the value of the Amazon rainforest appears on no ledger until it is stripped of its foliage and converted into farmland? So again, the Amazon forest in many ways has no value in and of itself until it is stripped and turned into soybean pasture. So again, he talks of a misplace of value. And the real question is, we got to come back to the question of what are our values? And this is where we end up in what I call a poverty of discourse. We focus on knowledge to the detriment of wisdom. We support intellect, but not imagination. We give credence to reason, but not to emotion. And we focus on a culture of science as opposed to against a culture of faith. So there's one set of language that's applicable, that's used and allowed in public discourse, and another set of language, wisdom, imagination, emotion, and faith, that's privatized, that's not allowed in the public discourse. So the question is how to permit this other language in our public debates on the environment. And this is where we need a contemplative discourse, that allows us to plumb the depths of our relationship. And I think encyclical ecology from Pope Francis really tries to get at this, where he talks of the social, the cultural, the ecological, the ecclesial, the community. There's 4 different dreams. Whenever we're talking about ecology, it's not simply the scientific part, it's not simply the social or cultural or communitarian, it's all of it together. In other words, he's really asking for a fullness of the human experience of nature. Wonder, mystery, delight, awe, beauty, lament, fear, joy, sacred care, contemplation, and reverence. In a word, love. And this is the fullest experience, and how to have a language that allows us to talk about this experience. And I think that's what's really needed, especially in the public realm, in the political realm. Because we're really asking about what is most sacred. That's the question we should be asking. What is most sacred? In other words, what matters most to humanity? And that's I think what we mean when we say sacred. It's what matters most. We can live without diamonds, but we can't live without clean water. We can't live without clean air. We can't live without an environment that's habitable, that gives us life, that gives us joy. So these, in effect, become sacred, and we need a language to talk about that. My second image that comes to mind is nature as word, and we as the hearer of this word. In other words, nature is a verb. Nature speaks. In the beginning was the Word. You may recognize this from John, Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1. We read every Christmas day. This is the gospel reading we have. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He was with God in the beginning. So this whole focus on creation as speaking something of its creator. And I'll talk a bit about more of that next week. But in other words, when I talk of creation, I'm really speaking about a theological image. How creation came about, we have to use our brains and our minds, our scientific insight, our scientific methods to understand that. So I used to kind of share with the students at UBC in Vancouver. So when you leave the chapel, don't let your brains fall out. When you leave the lab, don't let your brains fall out. In other words, be attentive to all the questions, because every question is legitimate and every question needs to be asked. So nature is a word. In other words, it's a given. It's not of my making. We don't make a forest. We don't make a flower. It's given, it's incomprehensible, it's mysterious. It has its own integrity. It has its own vocation, if you will, before God. And so there's something about nature that, again, is not of our own making. This is an image of a lichen called Xanthoria polycarpa. It grows on twigs, often on the coast. Certainly in Newfoundland, you get a lot of the salt from the sea, and it enriches the twigs, and they can support this kind of luxuriant lichen growth. And people will often ask me, what good are lichens? And I could talk about their scientific value, ecological value, pharmacological value, aesthetic value. There are many values of lichens. But in the end, I just like to say they're good simply because they exist. In other words, they're good because they're created, and in their own way, in the lichen's own way, they give glory to their creator. They give glory to God. That's what we're asked to profess. Glory to God in the highest. We profess all the time in the Gloria, in our Eucharist. So all creation gives glory to God, and in a sense, I think there's a secret hidden in creation that's salvific. Imagine if you were born on the moon and grew up on the moon, if that was possible. What kind of poetry would you write? What kind of music would you create? What kind of painting would you produce, would you create? What would be your images of life? What kind of scientific questions would you pose? But no, we've grown up on the earth, and we've evolved. We who are creatures like every other thing on the face in the universe, we've evolved together over millions and billions of years. And so our imagination has in many ways been crafted through eons of evolution. And so the questions we pose, the poetry we write, the literature we create, the music we create, is in some way a reflection of this created energy, this created world. And so creation in many ways is salvific, beyond our wildest imagination. Mourning nature, loss, grief, and lament. There's also the reality, the harsh reality, that we are well aware of how our actions have created a world that there's a sense of loss, there's a sense of destruction, there's a sense of change in many different fields, in many different ways. This is a quote, just like what I have here. This is a quote from a book by Cormac McCarthy, no relation. It's a great American writer, author of All the Pretty Horses, Blood Meridian, The Child of God, Cities of the Plain. He won the Pulitzer Prize for this book. It's called The Road, published in 2013. And it's a story of a man and his son in a post-apocalyptic world. We don't know how the world ended up that way, but the world is full of cannibalism. Humans have become cannibals. Death reigns, and all there is just ash and darkness and death. And I loved it, so maybe that's a sign of my mind. I just like to read the first couple of lines in the beginning. This is the first few lines of the book. He talks about the father and the son. When he woke in the woods in the dark and the cold of the night, he reached out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Nights dark beyond darkness and the days more gray, each one than what had gone before, like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. It's a beautiful image, like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. So 240 pages in my edition of dark, ash, cannibalism, death, and violence. In the end, he has one paragraph about brook trout that used to live in the streams and the mountains. And it's the only the only paragraph in the book that has color, that speaks of color. And I just like to read that to you now. Once there were brook trout in the streams of the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. I know what that moss smells like growing up in Newfoundland. On their backs were vermiculate patterns. There were maps of the world and its becoming, maps and mazes of a thing which could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than humanity, and they hummed of mystery. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. In many parts of the world, we are experiencing loss, extinction, destruction, loss of beauty, loss of hope. And so we're really called to a conversion. We're called to a new way of relating. This is the Lower Churchill River in Labrador, the Labrador Boreal Forest. This is what it looked like a couple of years ago, Muskrat Falls on the left, and this is what it looks like today. You may have heard of the Muskrat Falls hydro development that was just put in place, billions of dollars overrun. It's also a land where the Innu live. And the Innu, I'll introduce Elizabeth Pinashue just in a few seconds. When you build a dam in the Northern Boreal and you put a reservoir, there's a lot of mercury in the organic matter that's naturally there. And when you have a reservoir and you get these anaerobic conditions, the mercury often comes out into solution, and it can get into the invertebrates and get into the life chain, if you will. And so what was once a land, a river that gave hope, great life, there's now suspicion. The suspicion of disease, the suspicion of death, of sickness, because of the elevated levels of mercury in the Boreal River reservoir that you need to build a reservoir behind the dam. And so in the light of this and many different other projects, Chungwish Elizabeth Pinashue, she's a Innu elder, Catholic, woman of faith, a woman of dialogue who strives to build bridges. This is her published book, I Keep the Land Alive. Her diaries were published a few years ago by the University of Manitoba Press. And we've kind of kept in touch. We communicate on a regular basis, and I was able to visit her last summer, and thus the picture from the right. And she has been one who has witnessed to the beauty and the goodness of the lands and waters of Labrador, to the beauty and goodness of her people, the Innu, and the beauty and the goodness of her family. Not to deny the many heartaches that she holds as a mother and as a grandmother. But she is one who seeks hope and who builds bridges. Again, I'd like to read, if I have time, I'd just like to read the last few lines of her book. Each spring, she would walk on the land, and in the hopes just to witness to the beauty of the land, and she hoped that people would come and spend time with her. And this is what she said, and it's called Still Walking, from the last of her diary notes. I was walking by myself one beautiful day. The dogs were behind me, and I had my tea and biscuits, and I wasn't afraid of anything, not wild animals, nothing. When I got to the marsh, I sat down for a rest and a cup of tea, just me and the dogs. It looked as though they were dancing. The trees were swaying in the wind, all different kinds of trees. It looked as though they were dancing. I wondered why I was all alone, why people didn't want to walk with me when I'm trying to protect the land and the animals, our culture, our children, our way of life. There'll always be money, but if the land is gone, it's gone. I hope people will understand this one day. In the meantime, I'll just keep trying to make a good mesh canoe. Mesh canoe is the walk that you would do in the spring for future generations. I feel as though the dancing trees are my friends, as if they're saying to me, don't worry, we're here, and we know you care about us. Don't cry in your heart. We're still here, still dancing. It was a clear day, and I could see the mountains in the distance. Then I put my thermos away again and started walking. And so in her annual walks, she witnessed to the beauty and to the goodness and to the hope in her own grief. You know, a broken world can lead to a broken heart. And so just as our relationship with each other, with our brothers and sisters, our family, our loved ones, when that's broken, our heart is broken. And so when our relationship to the natural world is broken, we too are left with a broken heart. All creatures, great and small. It's amazing that the image of the Garden of Eden, that right from the beginning in Scripture, in the Judeo-Christian Scriptures, in the book of Genesis, all of creation is presented as being together. In other words, there was this amazing intuition that we're all in it together, all our relations. And so the Garden of Eden has Adam and Eve with all of creation and depicted in many different ways over the centuries. And remember after the flood, you know, in Genesis chapter 10, after Noah built the ark, and Noah, interestingly, he built the ark, and he was invited by God to bring onto the ark every creature, male and female, of every known creature of the world. And why is that so? Because we're all saved together. You know, and what was really amazing, just go back to that, after the flood, and God says, no longer will I again destroy the earth. And there'll be a sign of my covenant with you and all creation. And that sign will be the rainbow in the sky. And so notice it's a cosmic covenant. It's a covenant that God made with God's people over countless generations, and here with Noah and his family and his ancestors, and with all of creation. So he makes a cosmic covenant with all of creation. Blake Dubosky, well-known Ojibwe artist from the Chigin area, he recently passed away. This is the Tree of Life at Anishinaabe Spiritual Center, just outside of Espanola. It's a huge, magnificent piece. And Christ, as you can see in the Tree of Life, Arbor Vitae, Christ is crucified with all his relations, with all of life. And so the tree of life, the tree of death, becomes the tree of life. And Charles Darwin had the same intuition, except from a scientific point of view. His Origin of Species, published in 1859, he says, you know, this quote is from the last line in his book, you know, where he says, it's interesting to contemplate a tangled bank. He says, it's grandeur in this view of life, in other words, the view of evolution. From so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wondrous have been and are being evolved. So Darwin, I think you should be, Origin of Species should be required reading for all people working in the church. But it just opens up to a whole nother vision of the world, which is really the vision of Genesis and the vision of the cosmic covenant as well. That it's all our relations together. And as you can see, we're all related. And with all due respect to my relative here, the chimpanzee, there's only about 4% difference between the human genome and the genome of the chimpanzee. Now that, as you see, there's lots of similarities, but also significant differences as well. But all to say, we're related. Forests as myth and memory. I spent a lot of time, many, many years studying forests from a scientific, from a management point of view. But I came to understand forests as in a whole different way for myself over the years. Growing up in Newfoundland, I was all my time on the barrens, on the coast, in the forest. And I was smitten by nature, you know, seduced by nature, and the love affair has never ended, thankfully, I think. Forest comes from the Latin foris, which means outside. So the forest was defined as that which was outside the land of culture, the land of law. And you remember Robin Hood, and his band of merry men in the Sherwood Forest. They were outside the law. They became outlaws because they were outside the city, outside the land of law and order as they lived in the forest. So in many ways, the forest became a refuge, has and still is. It's a refuge for lovers, a refuge for people escaping war, is a refuge for people seeking calm and hope. And so as we know, the boundaries of the forest are being breached through the Amazon forest. And I don't know about you, but there's something about this. For me, it's really it's kind of very visceral for me, that where I've seen roadless forests or roadless areas, then they become roaded, then they become logged, then become a place of our own making and our own doing. And the boundary keeps getting pushed further and further out, if you will. And I think we need, I think in the Amazon too, there's something about the loss of the Amazon rainforest that's not simply from a scientific, the scientific reason, cultural, ecological reasons are huge. But there's something about the loss of boundary, I think, that's really important for us as well. When there's no outside, there's no inside in which to dwell. So I think there's something about it. We need a refuge for grizzly bears. We need a refuge for polar bears and woodland caribou and all the creatures of the world. But we also need a refuge for the human spirit, an asylum where we can find peace and wholeness. And I know for many people, and for myself included, that is the forest provides that, or kind of wild land provides that in many ways. And so I think when the church reflected in 2019 in the Synod on the Amazon, and the Pope produced this beautiful document called Querida Amazonia, which means beloved Amazon. It's really the first time that the church took a biome, took an ecosystem, and asked the question, what does integral ecology look like in the Amazon region of the world? And the first line from Querida Amazonia, so just the document here, you can easily find it online. The first words of the Pope: the beloved Amazon region stands before the world in all its splendor, its drama, and its mystery. And God granted us the grace of focusing on this region. So it's beloved Amazon. It has a splendor and a drama and a mystery. And he says, God granted us the grace. So it's God's grace that helps us to focus on the Amazon. And I think God's grace is really asking us to focus on the boreal as well, the northern forest of the world. Boreas, the Greek god of the north wind. As you can see, this band of green from Newfoundland in the east, across all of Canada to Alaska, around into Scandinavia, Russia. And so it's a circumpolar halo of green, of boreal spruce and fir and birch and muskeg, right across. This is a beautiful image from the Hudson Bay lowlands, north of where I live, north of Timmins, Anawapiscot, James Bay area. And this now is a place of great interest. As you may have heard of the Ring of Fire, this large mining potential site. It's called the Eagle's Nest nickel mine area. It's a ring of fire. You can see this, it looks like a horseshoe. Apparently would make Sudbury look like a picnic. The huge deposits of nickel and palladium and silver and gold that are considered essential for the whole green energy transition, the electrification of transport. But I think when it's important to know what values we want to have in this region, in other words, people just want to go straight in and open it up and get as much out as quickly as possible. At the same time, this northern boreal region is home to many indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples as well, scattered throughout the boreal. And there are many concerns that people have when a large area gets opened up in such a significant way for a long time. So really, there's maybe a hope for us, and I know in terms of myself and the Jesuits are asking the question, what does integral ecology look like in the boreal? And could this be a new path of reconciliation for the church, indigenous faithful, civil society, as we look for a new way of reconciliation and healing in terms of preservation of the land, care for the land in the boreal region of Canada. So it's something something to be considered in the short time ahead, actually. There's another image that comes to mind. It's called Space and Place. I'd just like to return to the Torngat Mountains National Park. You can see in the upper part of the image, it's in northern Labrador. I had the privilege of spending several weeks there a few years ago at the invitation of Parks Canada. And I went around with many different people, researchers from around the world, but also with the local Inuit people. And my Inuit guide, we went around together. We were flying, obviously, because the whole area is inaccessible. And as we flew, the Torngat Mountains National Park is just an amazing landscape. It's for me, it was like a primeval landscape. You know, I knew that I wouldn't last a minute in the winter there. You know, it's just there's no hand of the human, if you will. And yet, as we flew around, my Inuit guide said to me, "There is where I shot my first caribou when I was a teenager." Or over there, that's where my family and I would always go pick red berries in the fall, partridge berries. So for me, it was like a wilderness landscape, and yet for him, it was a lived landscape. You know, so in other words, the space was a place. It was more of a space for me because I didn't have the relationship. I didn't grow up there, you know. And yet for him, it was a lived landscape. It had touched his heart, and it had given him meaning, really. And so I think what can happen is that landscape, this is really important for me. I know landscape becomes inscape. We're defined by the landscapes in which we grow up. You know, the supernatural BC, the mountains of the Rockies, the prairies, the boreal region of Northern Ontario, the sugar maple forests of the Ottawa Valley, whatever it may be, or the fog-drenched shores of Newfoundland or the Maritimes. These landscapes define us, and they give us a sense of who we are in many ways. And just one really important example from my own dad's life. My dad recently died, but he was a great fisherman, and he would spend as much time as he could on the river. For my dad, the river was a cathedral. It was his place that was sacred. And there was one particular river where my dad used to go every year, not far from his home in St. John's at the time. And he would go to that same bend, same pool, in the same bend, in the same river, in the same watershed, at the same time of the year, each and every year, to fish for salmon. And the Atlantic salmon would come up. You know, the Atlantic salmon, they're born in the river. They live a few years in the river, they grow, then they go back to the sea and go back to off of Greenland, the southern part of Greenland in the North Atlantic. And there they grow strong and mature, and they come back to the same river. They come back to the same pool, the same bend, the same river at the same time of the year to breed and to raise their young. Apparently they do it, there's an olfactory. They do it, they smell the river, they smell their way back home. And so my dad and the salmon always came together at the same time. And so what was it, you know, what was that mysterious pull of life that brought the salmon back to the same river, the same pool, and brought my dad to that same river and the same pool? And I don't know, I sometimes think that the salmon, in a sense, became Eucharist, you know, in a kind of Catholic theology sense, became Eucharist for my dad. It gave him life, you know, and take and eat, you know, this is take and eat my flesh and you will have life. And so my dad had great respect for the salmon, for the river, and for nature. So there's something about this indigenous knowledge, you know, there's this place-based knowledge that's somewhere. It's subjective, it's bodily, it's living, it's sensate. Whereas we often have a knowledge that's abstract, it's objective, it's expert knowledge, and it's really from nowhere. Whereas it's important about indigenous knowledge, and I would use the word indigenous in the full sense of those people who are intimately related with the land throughout the season over long periods of time, and in which space, physical space, becomes a place of meaning, and becomes a rootedness. You know, the monastic movement in the church really gets this. You know, they build their monasteries in beautiful places, and they build them well, and they build them for a long, long time. They want to stay there for centuries. Whereas Jesuits, we kind of, we think of the road as our monastery. We don't have that sense of place, because we're kind of always on the move in some way. So there's something about place and space that's really important. And Wendell Berry, the celebrated American writer, he says people exploit what they have merely concluded to be of value, but they defend what they love. And we love that for which we have a particularized language. We love that which we know in particular. Our backyard, the flowers on our windowsill, the forest outside our door, whatever it may be. The naming of the creatures. I think I'm going to get just watching my time there, so I'm going to have a chance for a discussion. Adam of the earth, Eve, the mother of life, to give life. The first vocation of Adam, given by God, interestingly enough, was to name all the creatures. That was his vocation. And there's something about a name. Imagine being born and not be given a name. You would effectively die. If not physically, you would die. Psychologically, you would die as a human. Because a name enters us into a relationship. Carl Linnaeus, a celebrated Swedish botanist from the 18th century, he had this intuition as well, and he gave us the binomial system of nomenclature. He gave it 2 Latin names, or Latin and a Greek name, to every creature on the face of the planet. So we're called Homo sapien, the wise hominid, the wise one. So every creature has a name. And I've been privileged, I must say, in my lichen research, Jose alluded to it at the beginning. I focus on biodiversity of lichens in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I've been privileged to work with specialists around the world and to give a name to lichens that never had a name before. Hymenelia parva, Biatura terranove, Aspilidia pruinosa. For me, these names elicit, I know where it grows, I know what it looks like, I know the environment in which it lives. So the name has a full sense of meaning, just like Mary Magdalene at the resurrection in the empty tomb. Only when Jesus uttered her name, Mary, did she recognize him. In other words, names give us a sense of meaning, puts us in relationship with the world. And I've been lucky we even named a lichen after St. Ignatius. We call it Cladonia ignatii. I found it in Guelph, actually. It's in the temperate Great Lakes region. And it's a new species. It's a good species. And so my colleague, Teuvo Ahti from Finland, he's a specialist in Cladonia, and Raquel Pino-Bodas from Spain did the genetic work. And Teuvo asked me, he said, why don't we name it after St. Ignatius? So I said, sure. So there's only one other plant named after St. Ignatius called Strychnos ignatii. It's called the Jesuit bean plant from the Philippines, South China, and it's the natural source of strychnine, the poison. So this is a much more benign type of creature, Cladonia ignatii. And I'm going to blow my own horn here. This, as Jose alluded to at the beginning, Aecoraspra McCarthyii, named by a Czech couple. And it's not a polar bear, it's not a panda, it's not a charismatic megafauna. It's a smudge on a rock, but it's my smudge on a rock. So anyway, there it is. That's Aecoraspra McCarthyii. And it grows, so far we've only found it in Newfoundland, but it may exist elsewhere. And it grows on rocks and in Newfoundland. So just as I get to the end now, there was a recent change to the Oxford Junior Dictionary. All these words that you see on your screen, heron, otter, newt, dandelion, bluebell, all these words were taken out of the Oxford Junior Dictionary and replaced by the following: broadband, voicemail, cut and paste, celebrity, bullet point. I suppose we got to keep up with the times, but in the end, if you lose the word, if you lose the name, then you lose the relationship. So in the end, is the only Apple we know Apple from your computer or whatever it may be. So integral ecology, my last thing, it's really, it's not a problem to be solved, but it's a joyful mystery. The world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and with praise. And it's the sacred language that enables us to enter into this praise and into this gladness. And so Blaise Pascal, the famous French philosopher, said, the heart has reasons of which the mind knows little. And so there's something about the human heart, the sacred contemplative language, that's essential, I think, in a rethinking, in a renewing of our relationship with the created world. So I'll just leave you with a question that maybe you would like to respond to in the chat or for next week. How do you experience the world of creation? In other words, what are your parables of contemplation? What is the kind of language you use? What are your experiences that enable you to enter deeply into the mystery of the beauty and the goodness of creation? So I thank you, and I'll leave it at that for this evening. And if you're game, we'll pick it up next week as well. So thank you very much. I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Father John. And now it's time to answer some questions from you. We have received a few already in the Q&A box. And we'll try to answer all of them, time permitting. So,
Sure.
and just to start, and I hear some background noise over there, John.
That's right. No, that's my, there's a fan, there's a cloud. Okay, there. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
No problem. The first question, how can I incorporate contemplative ecology into my daily life and personal practices? Can you give some examples?
You know, I remember doing a retreat one year, and basically, when most of my retreats are done either at our place in Guelph or, but it can be done on a daily basis. It's just to be, for me, like to be attentive. Contemplative ecology is a practice of people can call it mindfulness or attentiveness. And I think contemplative ecology is something to be prayed. You know, I think that there's something deep and powerful about even in the daily morning, like in your walk, if you have a system of walks, or with your coffee in the morning, just looking out, even on the flowers on your windowsill, or something that's beautiful, you know, to look on the good, the true, and the beautiful, and that becomes a habit. There's an attentiveness to that which is good, and that which is true, and beautiful, and that instills within us, I think, that instills within us a depth. My nephew just sent me a bird calendar. He's become a really quite a good photographer of birds, and he just picked up bird watching in his 30s. And I thought to myself, good for you. You know, in other words, he takes time to focus on what is beautiful. So just going out his backyard or down to the nearest park and just focusing on birds and identifying, you know, so. And I did a retreat one year. I just looked at the grass grow for 8 days, you know, believe it or not. And it's just like, there's just I think it's just an attentiveness. So I think that can, you know, we can incorporate that attentiveness and a prayerful attentiveness in our daily life in so many different ways. So I don't know if that helps, but it's really at our fingertips. It's really right where we are that we can do these things, yeah.
And just as an example, I just pasted the link to Ignatian and Jesuit spirituality centers in Canada. You can check out the list on the Jesuits of Canada's website. That's just one way to explore the topic more,
Sure.
Not only through retreats, but also resources that the centers can share.
Exactly. And I know the center in Guelph is very good on using the land on which they live as a kind of foundation for the spiritual life, very much so.
Another question, what made you choose science and not poetry or literature when you first chose your area of specialty?
My best subject was math and chemistry, and my worst subject was literature. It was in high school. I've always been fascinated by the natural world since I could walk, I think. And I always wanted to know why. Why is it like that? How does it work? And but that led me into the sense of beauty and majesty. And so, but I know, I read a lot of so-called nature writing, but good literature and good poetry, related to the natural world. And so it's like the language of science is really dealing with wonder. It's wonder and awe. And that's really what led me into science. I knew right from the beginning, I was like 5 or 6 years old, and I would go and share these science books with my teacher. I was a real geek. I was in, the Scholastic Book Club, and I collected rocks and butterflies and insects. And so, but it was, I think it was related to the sense of beauty as well. And that's where literature and fine arts come in, I know I could never, I knew I could never, I just didn't seem to get it, but it's only now that I spend a lot of my time with good literature and good poetry that helps me to enter into this other world as well, because both deal with wonder and both deal with awe. And I love the way words work and interact. And there's a beauty in how they come together to create an image. So I just had a natural inclination that way, and I just went where I had life. I just knew what I wanted to do. Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be a dualism between both.
No, not at all. That's right. It's I think in theology. I think if anything I learned in theology, it's that life is always it's never an either or, but it's always both and. And again, that's really the mystery of our Christian language. We say truly human, truly divine. It's not either or, but it's both and how to embrace that mystery. It's a real tension, and how to live that mystery. Because we can't understand both and yet that's why I think we're kind of called to do. We kind of live on that edge. The science is my bread and butter. I'd love to do it full time because I know that that brings me in. The life of research brings me into the life of wonder and beauty and mystery, and the two go together quite well for me.
Another question we just received: is putting things into a language automatically an intellectualization of the emotional? Can true emotion, wisdom, and faith be really expressed? When it is expressed, does it not turn into ideology?
Yeah, that could be the danger, I think. Yeah, it's interesting in your question. When I, as it was being said to me, I was thinking of, like in Scripture, they talk about you can never look at God and live, right? Like the ineffable is the burning bush, or in Islam, you take your shoes off, when you go in the mosque. There's something about being on holy ground. So there is a sense of the ineffable, the incomprehensible, where I can't put words to it. And yet I think just out of our human desire for understanding, we try to do the best we can. So science gives a certain explanation, but I think that's where maybe the poetry and the fine arts and the music, it kind of dealing with the same experience, the same reality, but gives it a whole different language. So it tries to. Yeah, you're absolutely right. In one sense, you're just kind of awestruck. You sense like you just before the ineffable mystery, and all you can do is bow. All you can do is get on your knees and put your head to the ground. So there's that, and then, but in order to be how to share that experience, that's when we try to get in then to kind of language and try to give it to some word. Or maybe it's not language, maybe it's art, or it's music, or it's dance, or it's science. which are ways of expressing the ineffable in some way. They're limited. Our language is limited, and that's why I really, talk about God. I always get kind of hesitant. I mean, it's like just it's not a category like a cat or a chair or a mouse. It's totally different, and yet we end up using language. So I think maybe to have a sense of humility and to say that everything we say, there's always something more that's the opposite of that is also true. So to kind of live in that tension and live in that sense of humility before the incomprehensibility really of creation.
Thank you. Can you provide examples of communities or organizations that have successfully implemented contemplative ecology principles and seen tangible or seen results?
Just lots of different maybe groups. I as you pose that question, I think of the monastic communities. I visited a community a few years ago in Squamish, north of Vancouver, and women, contemplative Dominican sisters, and they were just constructing their monastery at the time. And so we lived in an old bus, and we got a chance to visit with them. And anyway, the monastery is being constructed. I have never seen it. I've only seen pictures of it. But they have their chapel facing this. They're facing the Tantalus mountain range, which is a glacier-capped mountain peaks. And that's where they decided to put their chapel. So when they go to pray so many times each day, that's what they face. So they've kind of explicitly and in a very kind of direct way, they said, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to build our life together. And so I think that's, for me, in many other contemplative monastic communities as well, people have decided that's how they do that, or families and how they live, or how they recreate together, what they decide to do, or there's so many different ways, NGOs too, what they decide to stand for, what they decide to focus on. I suppose there are kind of a multitude of ways in which that, according to their own concrete situation, that's the key, I think, to look around in community with others and to ask the question, what does integral ecology look like here? Or what does an attentiveness to our world, our neighborhood look like here? And then what to do from that, So, a multitude of ways. But I just think back to the monastic communities, which tend to have a long tradition, right? They have hundreds of years of how to build and where to build and how to build it. It's a very kind of a key. It's like a geography of salvation. So geography, they're aware of the geography in their contemplative life, in their community life.
It looks like someone posted a link to the Queen of Peace Monastery in the chat. So I don't know if
yes, in Squamish, that's it then. Yeah, okay.
I am not sure, but it seems like it is. So thank you to
thank you very much.
Posted it. It's a gallery. Another question. Someone asked if you think our Catholic liturgy will ever evolve to bring in the sacredness of earth, like Taylor de Chardin did in his Cosmic Mass.
It's interesting. That's why I'm kind of focusing next week on the Trinity. It's how I look sometimes. I see the ways in which the things that we say and the things we don't say, and I find there's a lot of resonance there, but it's often not it's not given credence, or it's not expressed, or it's not acknowledged. But I remember John Paul II he had his encyclical on the Eucharist, and he basically said that every time the Eucharist is celebrated, in the great cathedrals, to the countryside, on the side of the road, on the mountaintop, it's always celebrated, he said, on the altar of the world. And that was a definite allusion to Teilhard de Chardin, certainly. And so, because he says all of creation is brought together. We take the bread and the wine, which comes from the earth and is the work of human hands, and it becomes the center of our community, becomes the focus of our salvation. We become what we consume. So in a way, it's all there, but it's often, we're not aware sometimes. I know the Eastern Church, I think, is better in terms of the liturgy, in terms of the construction. Here at our Jesuit community here in Sudbury, the chapel was built, and we're on a beautiful lake, and yet the chapel was built with no windows. It was built inside I think it was to mimic something else that the Jesuits were used to. And so it has a skylight. It's very beautiful in its own, very simple, very beautiful. And yet for me, I often thought, I could miss the icon of creation that surrounds us, whereas the Dominican sisters in Squamish had that insight. Whereas my brother Jesuits, when they built this place, decades ago, didn't have that. It just wasn't in the people's minds either. It wasn't in their thought, So I think the liturgy as it's done now, it's the church's liturgy, but I'm always looking for ways in which how it's expressed, and I can see many different in between the lines. Glory to God on the highest. And that's all of creation giving glory, or the elements of the earth become the body and blood of Christ. In that sense, so it's all there, although it often can be seen as kind of neutral or opposed in some way to it, But I think it does exist. It does exist, and maybe there are reforms that will be needed, and that different ways people can bring it in. I used to do a lot of masses with students at UBC, University of British Columbia. We do hikes in the mountains, and we have snowshoe in the winter, and just a great joy to on the mountain with the students, and they felt that as well, to be able to have the Eucharist, on the solid rock of the cliff face or whatever, and so we can do it in different ways. Maybe in our own communities, I often thought, just having Eucharist outside on a more regular basis, if that's possible, or different ways, So there's creativity and imagination that's certainly available from that point of view as well.
Speaking of students, someone asked, what suggestions would you have for our education system and providing our youth the opportunity to reacquaint themselves with place-based or nature-based knowledge?
There's I gave a talk once years ago to a group of environmental educators in Newfoundland. I was really quite impressed by what they were doing. There are many schools and initiatives of teachers at universities or primary all through that really focus on place-based and nature-based. There's even a group, I go walking in a park close by here, and just this morning I met 10 young people all dressed up, because we're still winter here in Sudbury, and they had their two teachers there, and they go out on a regular basis throughout the entire winter and the summer as well, focusing on that. And for me, I had it naturally. I was just naturally in the woods growing up in Newfoundland. My parents passed that on to me, my dad in particular, So, and I went into science right away. So I was always nature-based, kind of empirical. But there are many different programs at different schools, or even to initiate programs that are kind of these, outdoor education. And there is a group of, I'm sure, the Canadian Association of Environmental Educators have a lot of maybe good resources in that area as well.
Another question. So it's on more on the policy side. How can we see improvement on the accountability of Canadian mining companies, especially on overseas operations?
Yeah, the Canadian mining companies overseas, they often work under different political regimes that are not as maybe stringent or as we would have in Canada. But I think they're under law. I think, I could be wrong in this, but I think they have to follow the same regulations that they would in Canada. We used to be involved, Task Force on Churches and Corporate Responsibility, when I was a young Jesuit. We used to go to we used to buy shares in different companies, particularly mining companies. And so we'd have a voice at the annual general meeting and, things like that. But it's really kind of working through your local NGOs, if you're part of that, or even, the churches. The churches has Kairos, there's different groups, Jesuit Forum, the different kind of religious-based NGO movements that engage these questions. Canadian Jesuits International, quite involved in the issues of human rights and environmental sustainability in the corporate world, especially overseas. And so many different avenues. Really got to discern at one's own level how best to engage it, in terms of time and energy and one's inclination too, where one finds that one can make a contribution.
We got time for a couple more questions. The first one is, how can we convince individuals, well, maybe not convince, but work with individuals who may not be religious or spiritual to care about the environment and take action, who may not have that mindset, that outlook?
I think much of what I talked about today could be, in a sense, someone could have given maybe the presentation from a totally different perspective, so-called green. There's a really deep movement now, deep ecology or green religion, in which they may not have a sense of the transcendent, just in terms of the traditional Islam, Judaism, Christianity, but nature, in a sense, becomes the transcendent, or becomes way in which they enter into the sense of mystery. So I know a lot of people, you would say, yeah, I'm deeply spiritual, but I'm not religious, or not part of a religious, community, faith-based community, and yet do have that kind of the same inclination is there, the same language is there, and I think it's there's something about creation in and of itself that calls for kind of a mystical or spiritual religious language. And by that I don't mean otherworldly. I mean, this is really deeply empirical. It's concrete. True spirituality is true concreteness. It's not in the clouds by any means. And so many people have that already, but they wouldn't use the language that I would use, or that I'm comfortable with or know best. They would relate to nature. There was Professor Goodenough. A lot of scientists now will write about nature or about science, about creation, not necessarily from any kind of theistic point of view, but they find meaning and purpose, and I would say salvation. Author game, they find salvation in and through their scientific work, and in and through their relationship with the natural world, that may have no relationship whatsoever, at least in an obvious way, to the monotheistic religion per se. But I think that the dialogue is really there's great space for dialogue there, because I think that green religion, in my mind, I would say, is really consonant with kind of a Trinitarian mysticism, except I use different language for it. So I think really the biggest thing for me in dialogue is really to ask the person, is to find out what is the person's experience. What do they experience? We all desire what is good. I think we all desire what is beautiful. We all hope for truth. We seek justice. So I think like true religion, as I said at the beginning, is authentically human. It doesn't mean we don't get it wrong sometimes, and we don't we end up in ideology, or we get kind of wacko sometimes. But authentic religion that's discerned, that's serious, it does, and it call to joy. We all seek joy, like Pope Francis' emphasis on the joy of the gospel. And so there's great room for dialogue, especially in the area of environmental concerns and beauty and awe and what can give us hope in engaging the challenges that are around us. So I hope that's of some help.
One last question, really brief answer. Can we have a guided contemplation next week? Someone asked. Can we have a guided contemplation?
Guided contemplation. Okay, I'll see what I can come up with. How long? I don't know how. We'll see what we can work with. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. Right now, I would just like to thank you all for joining us today. Remember that the second session in this series will be next Wednesday at the same time. A day before the session, we will remind you of the details on how to join, and an hour before the session too. And remember that a recording of the webinar, today's session, will be shared with you 3 business days after today, by 3 business days. And also, finally, remember to fill out the brief poll that will pop on your screen after the end of the session today. It really helps us to know what we can do better next time. Thanks again to all of you, to our translators, Albert Baudry, Michel Côté, for ensuring that everything was working and understood by everyone. And thank you again, Father John, for your wisdom, for your insights. We'll see you next week. And thank you all for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciated it. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
See you next week. Thank you.
Next week. Thank you, Jose. Okay.